Welcome. So it's just noon now. I'm sure we'll have people joining us over the next few minutes. But thank you for joining us for Save the Sounds webinar, Advancing Coastal Protection with Living Shorelines. We are going to have time for questions and discussion at the end. If you have a question as you go along, you can put it in chat or just wait until the end and raise your hand, but we will be saving time at the end and moving through the presentation first and then getting to questions. This afternoon, we have Katie Friedman, our Director of New York Ecological Restoration Programs, with a background in urban watershed restoration and planning, wetlands protection, water quality monitoring, and aquatic ecology, and Jake Dittes, professional water resources engineer and Save the Sounds Director of Connecticut Ecological Restoration Programs. So we're thrilled to have them both with us this afternoon to share what they can about advancing coastal protection with living shorelines. So with that, I'll hand it over to Katie and Jake. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to be here and talking with you about advancing coastal protection with Living Shorelines. Again, I'm Katie Friedman, our New York Director of Ecological Restoration, and I'm happy to be joined by my Connecticut counterpart, Jake Dittes.
Hey everybody.
Save the Sound, as you know, has many different facets. We work on water quality, lands, we have a legal team. Jake and I are housed within the Alexander Center for Ecological Action. So our team leads hands-on habitat restoration and resiliency projects. We really focus on creating physical change on the ground that strengthens our natural ecosystems, that benefits wildlife, but also our local communities in the Long Island Sound region. We have many different types of projects that are really our bread and butter. We are focused on aquatic connectivity. So we take out derelict dams to restore rivers. We also capture stormwater to reduce flooding and pollution through green infrastructure like rain gardens and bioswales. Today we'll be talking about coastal restoration. We work on marsh restoration, shellfish restoration, and we also have a Doherty Climate and Resilience Institute that's focusing on our main pressing issues related to climate and resilience throughout the Sound. We all know our coastlines are facing multiple threats. Here, this is a picture of locally in Blind Brook in Rye. We have an eroding marsh butting up right against residential development. So marshes and our coastline are facing threats from development, from erosion, from our coastal forces, and sea level rise and flooding. So we'll be talking about these threats and how Living Shorelines can pose a solution and provide many different benefits to our coasts and our communities. First, I wanted to start off by talking about coastal wetlands. What are coastal wetlands? These are critical ecosystems. They are flooded by tidal water. So they have these really unique plant communities that have adapted and evolved over time to live with their feet wet for part of the day and dry for part of the day as the tides come in and out. Wetlands provide habitat for juvenile fish. They provide these calm, sheltered waters. They also can provide habitat for benthic organisms. A lot of the time we'll see mussels clustered around the base of salt marsh plants. Birds really rely heavily on salt marshes and wetlands for habitat and for foraging. And of course, we as humans recreate along wetlands, and they provide a lot of benefits to us beyond recreation. These coastal systems buffer wave energy and help protect our shoreline from intense storms. And wetlands can also absorb floodwaters coming from the upland. As you see in this picture, this is at in Mamaroneck and Rye. This is a wetland complex, and every single plant that you see here is constantly photosynthesizing. And that means that it's pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and serving as a carbon sink, which helps us to fight climate change. Salt marshes are a really unique community. they live and thrive within this thin band of intertidal water. So this is a really helpful cross-section of different marsh zones. On the left, we're looking at the low marsh. This is an area that thrives between average high tide and average low tide. And the species that we find here typically is Spartina alterniflora. This grass species is really responsible for keeping the edge of the marsh intact with its dense root structure. And if we move upland in elevation, we get into the high marsh area. Here we have a little bit more diversity in plant species. These are typically shorter cord grasses, and these plants are able to be flooded with tidal waters, but less frequently than the low marsh species. And then as we move upland into elevation, we start to see in a salt marsh more shrubby and woody plants starting to transition into upland vegetation. And so these specific plant species really rely on existing at a certain elevation and experiencing that very thin band of tidal fluctuation. And this means they are at risk of losing ground to sea level rise, but also to development. So here we have a map showing wetland loss at Ash Creek from the 1880s on the left to 1990. And Long Island Sound as a region has lost a third of its wetlands since the 1880s. Today, there's almost 8,000 fewer acres of wetlands. This was from a study published by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And a lot of this loss is primarily driven by development. So humans, we want to live along the coast. A lot of wetlands have been filled in, paved over, have become communities or industrial or commercial use along the waterfront. And this is where you see a lot of flooding happen. When you see continuous flooding from storms, even from high tides, a lot of the times it's indicative that that area was once a coastal wetland. And if we look even at a more developed area, New York City itself has lost 85% of its marshes in the last century in New York Harbor. So we're really losing this critical protective buffer ecosystem along our coasts. Like I said before, marshes really rely on their elevation in relation to sea level in order to survive. And so as sea level rises, if we look at this top figure here, marshes are going to need to be able to migrate upland in order to thrive. A lot of the time along our coasts, we have development right up against the shoreline. We're looking now at the second row here. Where we see bulkheads or hardened shoreline, seawalls. And so as sea level rises, that marsh is not able to move upland. It's stuck between the sea and a hard place. And so that marsh is going to be lost to drowning because of sea level rise. So one of the many benefits of installing a living shoreline, which we'll explain in a lot more detail, is that, oh, I think we need, I think I'm hearing some background. Thank you. So as we install a living shoreline that's made of natural materials, we allow that marsh some space to migrate as sea level rise so that we preserve the protective benefits from the marsh and the ecosystem. And we also encourage development to be set back from the shoreline, not only to enhance habitat, but really, again, to provide space for this protective buffer of wetlands. This is probably a scene that you're used to seeing when you're out on the water. Property owners, when they're faced with erosion, a lot of the first knee-jerk reaction is to build a hardened shoreline. That's what we've done for many years. So that may be a bulkhead, it may be a seawall. And these are really static infrastructure. They don't grow as sea level rises. They also can actually cause some more erosive forces. And so we are really excited about exploring living shorelines in our region. So these are shoreline stabilization techniques that protect the coast from erosion, but they also preserve our natural ecosystems. And as our sea levels continue to rise, as we're getting more and more storms, using nature-based features is going to be a really important tool in our toolkit. What's also great about living shorelines is that there's a lot of flexibility in the types of living shorelines that you can create. There are marsh plantings at a minimum. You can create some softer fibrous sills that protect marsh ecosystems. If you have higher wave energy, you can incorporate rock or shellfish. And then there's also opportunities to use woody materials for live crib walls and plantings. So there's, again, flexibility, and you can really tailor a living shoreline, and should tailor a living shoreline to your site conditions. Not every shoreline is going to need the same type of stabilization techniques. In areas where you have calmer waters, you can focus on marsh plantings and vegetation only. But as the wave energy gets more and more intense, you can incorporate harder materials, whether that's sills, breakwaters, and in areas where you have the most intense, coastal erosion and critical infrastructure, there's of course more gray and harder solutions. Here's an example of two different types of shoreline techniques. This is at Stratford Point in Connecticut. On the top, you'll see the shoreline has a hardened seawall and big riprap boulders. You can see there's not a lot of ecological diversity at this location. If you look around the corner below, this is a really exciting living shoreline project that was installed by Sacred Heart University, Yukon, and Circa. Here we see reef balls that were placed out in the intertidal that can serve as breakwaters, but also solid habitat for oysters to attach to and grow. That marsh is really flourishing behind those reef balls. They are, again, dissipating wave energy. The marsh is capturing sediment from incoming waves and really thriving. So this is, the same area, but two very different types of shoreline protection, one with a lot more ecological diversity and habitat benefits. Here's a graphic showing how when a wave hits a hardened shoreline, the energy is actually deflected back and over the structure, causing it to erode behind it. So these seawalls are really temporary. When a wave hits a living shoreline, however, you can see that the wave energy is actually dissipated and absorbed over the living shoreline features, whether that's oyster reef, breakwater, and also the plant material itself. So this way the wave energy is softened. With a hardened shoreline, we are looking at how waves actually, as they hit the hardened bulkhead, they can actually get deflected towards the side, and you can end up eroding neighboring property. So this is, we think of it as this protective measure, but it actually can cause more harm on neighboring adjacent properties through erosion. Here we're seeing a graphic where wave energy is higher as it's coming towards a marsh, but then you can see that plant material slows down the waves, and you see lower wave energy as it meets the shoreline. Here again, we're looking at a graphic of a living shoreline of salt marsh protecting against wave energy, but also during storms, that plant material can absorb and slow floodwaters from the upland, while also sequestering nutrients from the water column and helping to improve water quality. So there's many benefits of living shorelines, and now I'm going to hand it over to Jake to talk about storm events.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So yeah, as that graphic showed, or alluded to, climate change is challenging our resiliency in this region with more rain coming during more intense storm events. So, Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy and Irene on back-to-back years really challenged our resiliency. And we see that trend in increased extreme precipitation events really showing in the last increasing in the last couple decades. And so that's one of our biggest problems or challenges to coastal protecting our coasts is more rain coming down, and with more rain comes more wind. And Katie, if we go to the next slide, or more with those more intense, more frequent storms, we get more wind. And wind is one of the challenges to coastal erosion. As Katie mentioned, there's multiple tools in the Living Shoreline toolbox to choose from in the range of how much stabilization we need. And really that is dependent on how protected each individual site is, which gets us to the concept of fetch. So fetch is the uninterrupted distance that waves can build. And so if we look at, this is that same Ash Creek project that Katie mentioned earlier that lost a lot of tidal wetlands nearby. But this barrier spit is super important. And if we get wind directly from the south, there's only a couple 100 feet for the waves to build. Same with wind directly from the west. But if we get wind from the southeast, that yellow arrow, the waves can build all the way across the sound to Long Island. And so that leaves us very vulnerable, or this particular spit very vulnerable to these storms that can build wave momentum across the entire sound. And so waves are an important factor in designing living shorelines. Katie, if you could go to the next slide. And then another factor which impacts where waves break is the slope of the coastal seafloor. So here we see a surfer and riding a wave in a gently sloped coastal seafloor. That wave breaks all the way out into, away from the shoreline. But as that angle gets steeper and steeper, the waves break just directly on the shore, which brings a lot of intense energy along that shoreline, which requires a lot of protection. And so a theme that I'll get back to later in the presentation, but the shallower the water depths, generally the further the waves break offshore. So now we're going to get through a couple projects that we're working on actively, taking up a lot of Katie and my energy these days. Chittenden is an exciting project we're working on in Guilford, Connecticut. This is a park that's accessible to the public. It's owned by the town of Guilford, and it's also importantly the marsh is 135 acres of critical habitat to the salt marsh sparrow. It's one of the which is an endangered bird in our region. And so if you can you go to the next slide, Katie? We see in the existing conditions on the left some very vertical faces of erosion. This is on the seaward marsh. And then in the map to the right, we see some lines drawn based on aerials, like old historic aerial imagery. So that line in purple, farthest out from the land, is where the shoreline and the wetland extended to in 1934. So that's 90 years ago. We were, a couple 100 feet further out from the land. And then from 1990 till today, we've lost about 200 feet of marsh and wetland from on the western side, and then about 30 feet on the eastern side, which is a little more protected. And so what we see today are those vertical faces of the marsh that are actively eroding, that are pictured in the left there. And Katie, can you go to the next slide? And so what we see here is that 1934 aerial in the background, overlaid with the tidal wetlands in green of current day, just to see what that change in shoreline looks like. I think that this is a pretty good graphic showing that. And so what are we doing about it? What's our plan? In the next slide, please, Katie. So the plan is to use one of the tools in the toolbox to lower the wave energy in the shore along that coast. That's the primary driver for erosion is wave energy. And so we're gonna put these. The plan is to put sills offshore with these rock sills that will help dampen that wave energy and cause those waves to break, as you can see in the graphics, over them. And so they'll absorb the energy and the shoreline will be much more protected. And this will allow for the natural sediment transport process to continue, and specifically having sediment actually deposit on the shoreline as opposed to erode is the goal here. And so reducing that wave energy and allowing the marsh to either erode at a much less rapid rate or actually expand is what we're hoping for at when the project is built in Chittenden.
Thanks, Jake. Another one of our project sites is in Douglas Manor, Queens. It's our Big Rock Wetland Restoration, which is a Living Shoreline project. This is located within Little Neck Bay, and within Little Neck Bay, we're looking in this picture at Udall's Cove. This picture was taken while standing on Memorial Field. It's a recreational field that was actually once wetlands, but was filled in like many wetlands in our area. And so we're looking out into Udall's Cove, and you can see those little patches of low marsh. So that's the Spartina alterniflora that typically holds the marsh edge intact. So we've seen erosion of this marsh ecosystem over time. There's been erosion of the field itself and the roadway that goes along this property. You can see in this picture there are big boulders along the edge of riprap, and those actually have been exacerbating erosion and not serving their desired purpose. So we are partnering with the Douglas Manor Environmental Association, who hired, who hired GEI engineers to come up with this design for restoration. So their goal here is to restore their marsh, to protect their property. And this project will entail placing oyster castles along the edge of the marsh. Oyster castles are eco-friendly concrete Lego blocks, essentially, that you can configure to certain dimensions and elevations. The goal is for these castles to break wave energy, but also they serve as hard substrate for oysters to colonize on. So in this project, we'll be setting castles down. We'll also be bringing in oyster shell that's been seeded with juvenile oysters. And the goal here is for those oysters to grow and thrive on this substrate. Again, that's dissipating wave energy, protecting the coastline from severe storms, also helping to trap sediment with incoming tides, allowing the marsh to grow vertically or accrete as sea level rises. And also interesting about this site, I talked about how the recreational field was once wetlands but filled in. At this site, we're going to be able to regrade the edge of that field and plant high marsh species. So we have multiple zones of salt marsh ecosystems. And as sea level rise, that will actually create room for that marsh to migrate upland, which is a really exciting component of this project. Also, along the roadway, we have different stabilization techniques that are proposed in the design, and these are based on the wave energy hitting the shore. Jake was talking about wave fetch and how that impacts wave energy. At the tip of this peninsula, towards the right, we experience the highest wave energy. And so along that shoreline, we are proposing a vegetated stone revetment. So that has plant material, but also some harder rock. Further down where wave energy is a little bit less, but still strong, we have a timber crib wall proposed that incorporates wood features and plants that will have their roots growing down and stabilizing the soil. And then further down into the cove where it's a bit more protective, there's less intense wave energy. there's a brush mattress design that really focuses mainly on plantings to hold the soil in. This design also incorporates removal of invasive Phragmites, which is a tall grass species that's invasive and quite hard to control. We'll be removing the Phragmites and also reestablishing tidal flow so that salt marsh can survive and flourish here. The name of the project, like I said before, is Big Rock, named after this big rock. This is a glacial erratic that was deposited by a glacier many, many, many years ago. And it's also a real cultural and spiritual significance to the Matinecock tribal nation. These are their ancestral lands. And so for this project, we've applied for funding to incorporate cultural monitoring, particularly during construction, so that if any artifacts or remains are found, we're able to coordinate directly with the tribe and ensure that they're reinterred properly. Throughout our coast in the Long Island Sound region, there's a really rich and important history of Indigenous communities, and so it's a priority for us to build those relationships and honor that as we do this work. In this image, we are looking down into Udall's Cove from the northern tip of the project, and you can see on the right what's eroding out from the shoreline is that historic fill, that rubble that was placed along the wetlands originally. So that's eroding out. You can see some of the roots exposed from a tree, and we're looking at some of that salt marsh that's in the off season. So taking this view, you can also see a little bit further down, there's a sand spit, a little small beach area where horseshoe crabs spawn. And so here's a view of current conditions, and the next slide will show us proposed conditions in the design. So here we're seeing many different types of features in a living shoreline. We have our oyster castles, we have the salt marsh restored, and then up along the shoreline by the roadway, we have those varying types of stabilization techniques using bioengineered technologies. So we have the stone revetment with plantings and a timber crib wall, and further down a brush mattress. But really wanting to highlight how living shorelines can be really complex and dynamic and creative and flexible with many different types of components to protect and enhance habitat. I wanted to focus too, particularly on the oyster component of this project. So like I said, oysters really rely on hard substrate in order to get their footing, and then they're able to grow on top of each other and form reefs. We used to have quite a few more oyster reefs in the New York and Connecticut areas of Long Island Sound, but lost a lot of those oysters due to pollution and overharvesting. So these projects help to bring back the oyster, which can really benefit all of us. Here's another example of a design that has multiple components of a living shoreline. Oyster castles like we've used, low marsh, high marsh. Some living shorelines include stone sills. And then you can see this picture on the bottom right of reef balls. So we're using oyster castles at our Big Rock project, but there's many different types of oyster reef substrate that you could choose from. Reef balls are similar to oyster castles, just a different configuration. It provides this hard surface area for the oysters to grow on, and you can see the oysters growing on one to the left and a fresh one on the right. And so oysters, they're this really critical keystone species. The reefs can really take the brunt of the wave force as it comes in. It's not going to, stop a hurricane from happening, but it can really help dampen the impacts as it lowers the wave energy that hits the shore. And different from, a hardened seawall that's a static solution, oyster reefs grow. They grow on top of each other and can grow vertically as sea level rises, which is a really great adaptive natural feature of a reef. So instead of a man-made breakwater that you'd have to repair over time, oyster reefs themselves grow and adapt to a changing climate. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jake.
So we mentioned the Ash Creek project a couple times already. This is a living shoreline we're just getting started on. But the problem can be seen in in the image on the right with a bunch of crazy contours. The takeaway from that is that from 2006 to 2016, this barrier spit lost about 60 feet it eroded about 60 feet laterally, like back into the land, and then lost 4 feet in elevation as well. And that barrier spit provides critical protection to the Great Marsh Island, which is a 13-acre marsh, and importantly, it's a marsh that hasn't been ditched. There's a big effort all along Long Island Sound of ditching these marshes with the idea of mosquitoes. It would reduce the mosquito population. Um, but so the barrier spit provides critical habitat, and it itself is also, or critical protection to marsh habitat, but it itself is also important habitat. Turtles and horseshoe crabs nest on that barrier spit, and so it's important for in its own right for the ecosystem. And so the goal will be to develop a living shoreline design here, and one of the pieces is one of the pieces that we'll use is something new. It's called sediment addition or thin layer placement. And the idea is that the Fairfield Marina, which is just to the west of the project site, dredges in order for boats to be able to come in and out of the marina periodically. So they'll take material and sediment that's been built up in that channel and dredge it. And the idea is that we will be placing that sediment in a beneficial location, so on the barrier spit or the marsh. And so, Katie, if we could go to the next slide, we'll explain a little bit about sediment. The reason we would put sediment on a marsh. So as Katie explained in the right image here, we have Katie, or as Katie explained earlier, marshes are very dependent on elevation. They grow within about a foot of the high tide water line, and so as that high tide increases with sea level rise, which we're growing close to a centimeter, seas are rising close to a centimeter in Long Island Sound every year at this point. And so as seas rise, the marshes are at risk of drowning. And so what the goal of this project, if we can go to the next slide, is to kind of bring the system into balance by adding material to the top of that marsh, so that because there's no room for it to laterally migrate, we'll bring it into this this balance with not a natural balance, but by big yellow machines, like bringing that marsh level up so that it can be resilient to sea level rise. And we do that in the next slide, Katie, with thin layer placement and sediment addition. So creating a slurry out of that dredge material and spraying it all over the marsh platform or the barrier spit. And then if you do so in lifts of 6 inches or less, that marsh grass has enough energy stored in its roots to just pop through that new sediment, and then that sediment or the marsh level is then 6 inches higher and can be resilient for years to come. And so that's the goal there with Ash Creek.
Thanks, Jake. We've been talking about projects that are a little bit on a larger scale, but wanted to inspire folks to take a look at your own backyard. So it is possible to do smaller scale living shorelines on private property. This is an example of one done in Larchmont, and wanted to show you the before. So here we're looking at an aerial of the property before construction. If you focus on the corner of that hardened shoreline, so again, this property owner had a hardened shoreline along the edge of their property. You can see there's marsh growing right next to it with nowhere to migrate. And keep your eye on the point, the corner there. So this is before. And this is after. So that corner of the hardened shoreline point is now an osprey nest. And they were able to pull back their hardened shoreline, which actually restored open marine habitat. And then they were able to install a stone toe, low marsh habitat, a little bit of high marsh habitat, and they incorporated a boat ramp. So this is just a really nice example. You can see now that that marsh is meeting up with the other marsh that wanted some room to grow. And although it's small, it's still very impactful. Another interesting component about this site, they actually pulled their seawall back in another location and found that there is natural rocky intertidal habitat here. So now this was all, under fill and bordered in by a seawall. But now that it's been pulled back a little bit, this rocky intertidal habitat is pretty dynamic. Seagulls and birds would drop shell. So you're starting to get little, the beginning of potential reef material. There's tide pools. So a lot of habitat complexity just going back to nature. So wanted to show these examples. So keep an eye on your own backyard, and we're here to help guide you if you have any questions about how to incorporate a living shoreline on your own property. And back to Jake.
Yeah, and wanted to talk about one additional project that we're just in the early phases of, but a living shoreline project, because to this point we've really talked a lot about the ecological benefits of these living shorelines, the connectivity of animals being able to get up onto the like animals going back and forth from the aquatic to the terrestrial habitat, and the value of marshes in itself. Basically everything that we eat either relies on something that lives in the marsh. Everything that we eat, like from shellfish or seafood wise, either eats something that grew up in a marsh or itself grows up in a marsh. And so that the value of those habitats are extremely important, and the living shorelines really provide an opportunity for additional habitat. But from an infrastructure and resilience point of view, living shorelines are also really important. Here is an example of erosion happening right up along a road in West Haven. Here's what the existing conditions look like. That eroded bank is as tall as Laura, our director of ecological action here at Save the Sound, in that right photo. So if we go to the next slide, Katie, this is in West Haven, Connecticut, which has a long line of beaches, about 3 miles long. Have a lot jetties at a lot of these beaches to try to keep sand from moving downstream, or from moving laterally and longshore drift. And so their residents can recreate and enjoy the beach. But where there is no jetty in this where the blue arrow is, that's the area that they continue to need to replenish every 5 years in order to protect that road. And so the next slide shows what it looks like today. We're getting close to that road, and it's going to need some treatment. But rather than doing the treatment in the way that they are doing, of just replenishing that beach every 5 years or so as needed, we're going to work with them to show something like this: a living shoreline with offshore the breakwater sills, and then oyster reefs a little bit closer. That'll provide some great intertidal habitat, and then that will also dissipate the energy so that the sand and dunes will be able to stay in place for and be much more sustainable and provide value to the town in the long run of keeping this project relatively stable. And so there's a couple other features that are important in this project, or a couple other opportunities to talk about. Katie, the next slide. One is the value that all of you guys and other volunteers can have on when we're done with some of these projects and needing plantings for dune restoration. Dune grass is important to stabilize the dunes, and it's a wonderful way to see these sites and stay involved. And so dune plantings in dunes is really important. And then the next slide. Something else that West Haven actually does pretty well. They have had a couple examples, especially post Sandy, where they've instead of having residents rebuild houses that have been destroyed or flooded with storms, they have actually bought out properties and have created the opportunity for managed retreat of renaturalizing some areas along the shoreline and along rivers that are susceptible to flooding, and to allow for additional buffers. And this is a really key tool in our restoration toolbox as well. That's very important. Katie, the next slide, please. And so with that, you know, all the idea is to re-envision our shoreline from kind of the hardened structures development, and think about what it could become for recreation and habitat. This is just a beautiful image of what it could be, and living shorelines are a piece of this opportunity. And the next slide, Katie. And so the point, a takeaway that I'd love for you to walk away from this this hour with us, is that we've done a lot of short-sighted engineering solutions. Hardened shorelines, seawalls, things like that are just one piece of that, of those engineering solutions. They solve the problem immediately, or the idea is that they try to solve the problem immediately. But there's been real biodiversity and resilience impacts to that. And so living shorelines are kind of coming into play at this low point of where we are now, I guess 2025. And so more living shorelines and building living shorelines on more of our coasts really give the opportunity to ensure a biodiverse future. So this is what it looks like generally, and obviously living shorelines are important in the next slide too, to the aquatic water quality, the aquatic habitat, the amount of biomass of fish and mammals in our waterways. You know, living shorelines are an important piece in ensuring a biodiverse Long Island Sound as well. And so with that, we'd like to thank you for spending an afternoon with us, with your lunch, and hopefully, and we welcome any questions at this point.
So if anyone would like to raise their hands or go ahead and unmute yourself or put a question in the chat, I'd be happy to read it for you. And thank you, Katie and Jake, again for that great presentation. It was I know I learned a lot and really appreciate it. Thanks. So any questions? Okay, we have a question in the chat right now from Carolyn. How about shorelines that are all stone and pebbles? So I think the question is probably, what would you recommend for a shoreline that is currently all stone and pebbles?
Sure, happy to jump in. So that's one of the great things about living shorelines. There can be many different types of features. If your shoreline is stony and pebbly, it could be a good opportunity to look at shellfish restoration. You have some hard substrate already on the property. And you can look a little bit more into the intertidal subtidal for more offshore breakwaters and sills in that regard.
Yeah, and one other point is that a lot of the same elements, the offshore breakwaters and sills will eventually trap smaller sediment, so the shoreline being pebbly and stony means that there's enough energy to move sand away from that shoreline. And so if you lessen the energy on that shoreline, there could be a little bit of smaller material to fall behind those sills and a grade as opposed to continually erode.
Okay, and then Josh has a question. Where is it? Just lost it. It was about are the sills and castles visible at low tide?
Yeah, good question. So it depends on where they're placed for the particular project. For oyster reef, you can have that exist in the intertidal, but you can also place reef habitat in the subtidal where you would not see it at low tide. Breakwaters, the further offshore you go, could be, underwater at low tide, but often these features are typically exposed. Just depends on their placement.
Chris, I see your hand up. Do you want to come off
Hey
mute?
everyone, hope you can hear me. Chris Lashley from Stantec. I just want to say really great presentation, really good overview. Katie, I wanted to say it was really good that you showed that it depends on the type of environment where these solutions can actually work. I think more people should focus on that, make sure that they're implemented in the right place and it's done correctly, because I think what we're seeing sometimes is that everyone's thinking, okay, living shoreline, let me get in on my shore, let me put it in place, and then something fails. And then what that does is that the public then loses confidence in these living shoreline solutions. So I think it's important that whenever we speak about these things, and I think you guys did a really good job here, is that we always talk about where is it applicable, what kind of environment, and there is a degree to how green it needs to be or it can be based on that environment. So I think you guys did a really, really good job there. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Chris.
Question.
Go ahead, Kate.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Katie. We've spoken on the phone. Nice to meet you. We have what was built as a living shoreline quite some years ago in Mamaroneck. You may be familiar. It's in the harbor, in Harbor Island Park. And they did this, the county built this in 2007. So, there's been some degradation and there's, questions about it. Back in those days, I don't think there was a maintenance plan put in place. So you get different things happening. Sometimes the Parks Department will go down there and just hack away some stuff. And there's some pressure by the neighbors now to go in there and redo it with something that they'd be more happy with, more gardeny looking stuff. So how would we, I'm on the committee for the environment here, chair of that, and but we don't really know, we don't have the expertise to tackle that, to go in to say, yeah, this is what we should do here, because it was built at some great expense with a lot of thought. And I think there's a good base of plantings, but I don't have the expertise to know what's best to do.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kate. So I think what we would suggest would be to hire a firm who could do a feasibility study for restoration at that location. We can certainly get out there ourselves and look with you and give you our advice. But happy to connect you with some engineering firms, and they can help either come up with a long-term adaptive management plan like you were referring to, or if some reconstruction has to happen, that's another direction. It's actually good timing. There's some great New York State grant funds available for coastal restoration and living shorelines. And then there's always the Long Island Sound Futures Fund grant. So happy to connect with you offline and tell you about some more resources.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and Katie, the comment about grant funding segues well into Lori's question in the chat. Who is funding these great shoreline projects, and what's plan B if federal funding suddenly dries up?
Yeah, great question.
Big question, but
Yeah, so at Save the Sound, we're lucky that we have a diverse portfolio of funding. We do have federal funding, we have state funding, and then we are really lucky to have members and donors and foundation grants coming in through the door. So for the Big Rock project, for example, that's funded by both federal and state dollars. And we just learned recently of a new state grant through the New York State Department of State that's focused on coastal resiliency as well. So New York State, as many as you probably voted for or know about, has an Environmental Bond Act that was passed. There's $4.2 billion available that's going to be administered through grants over the next 5 years. So very grateful that New York State has funding opportunities available. And we also really do rely on our members and our donors to help support these projects. And I'll hand it to Jake to talk about Connecticut funding too.
Yeah, just one thing to add. There for living shorelines and dam removals and culvert replacements, there's a real understanding from the municipalities and more local groups that removing that the long-term solution tends to from their perspective, the most cost-effective solution also aligns often with the more natural solution. And so, removing a dam or adding, in the case of West Haven, adding a living shoreline, that what is most cost effective in the long run tends to be the projects that we work on as well. And so there's starting to be an understanding, the town of West Haven is interested in funding this living shoreline because they will save money in the long run. It's not, it's not a quick fix project that would be, a seawall or something, but they will save money in the long run. And so there's some funding and appetite for these projects from that perspective as well.
thanks, Jake. Laura shared in the chat that the easiest way to keep up on plantings and volunteer opportunities and projects that we're working on is joining our email network, and she shared the link in the chat for those of you who are not yet on our list. We also have another question from Kristen. What type of plantings would be used in stone revetments?
That's a great question. I'm actually pulling up our designs now to find the exact type of planting, so stay tuned.
But it generally it's a plants that are able there's a ton of willows that we're going to plant and that kind of plants that we can put a live stake in. So like a 3-foot section of basically a stem of a tree that will then revegetate and grow once it has access to water and in its roots and reform in that way. So a lot of willows and a lot of plants like that. But Katie will have a final answer in a couple minutes. And then I see a question about examples of communities that have updated zoning regulations and to recognize that development is critical to living shorelines. So there are, I think this is a this is a question that a lot of that you know there's a lot of tension in terms of how best to use the coastal resources in local coastal resources. I don't think that there is I'm not aware. I know there are active towns that are actively engaging in this question of how best to protect their shorelines and allow for living shorelines and this managed retreat. But I don't know of any folks that have updated zoning regulations to reflect that yet. Besides, in Connecticut, the regulations statewide are now to predict a 20-inch sea level rise by 2050. And so that's kind of so that is reflected in the zoning regulations in terms of the height of that folks need to build. But I don't have any examples of local regulations changes.
Okay, and we have a bunch of comments thanking you all for a great presentation, and thanks for sharing all of that information, people commenting about how much they learned, how they appreciated it. Great work from Kyle, who lives near Ash Creek, always trying to stop people from digging it up and save the horseshoe crabs. So a lot of appreciation for this afternoon. It looks like Katie just put in the chat the plants. So the stone revetment plantings for Big Rock include groundsel bush, silky dogwood, marsh elder, and willow. And with that, any other questions? Well, thank you all for joining us again this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Thank you. It
everyone.
was great. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.